Today we're going to go over 14 tips and techniques to keep weeds from overtaking your farm. Number 1, cultivate, don't weed. Cultivating at least every week is probably the most essential thing on your farm. Just to kill the weeds while they're still super tiny, and so you're not down there pulling weeds, and it saves so much time and you have much better quality produce, because like lettuce, if you keep cultivating, you're not going to have weeds in there, so then you don't have to sort the weeds out of the lettuce. In some instances, the weeds crowd out your vegetables. So what I like to use is a collinear hoe. We have the Mutineer hose from Never Sink Farms. I'll leave a link to those in the description. It's super fast and easy. You just run it down your bed, work up the soil while the weeds are still really tiny, or even like just after they germinated, you mix them up or turn them over to so they're on top of the soil and then they die. Another thing is a stirrup hoe. Stirrup hoes are good for either big crops like say sweet corn, or your squashes, big things where you really have a lot of space. You can just get in there and cultivate it. Also, a wheel hoe is good for preparing beds and even larger spaces, pathways and stuff like that is where a wheel hoe can be useful. Another thing is, after you cultivate, you want to plan it so you don't have to water after you cultivate. Because if you cultivate, you stir up all those weeds, and then you water, they're just going to get water and grow back into the soil. So you kind of want to cultivate, have the sun kill all the weeds that you just expose their roots, and then maybe like the next day, then you water. Number 2, transplant as much as you possibly can. This gives you a 3 to 4 week period where if you were to direct seed, the seeds are in the bed and you gotta keep cultivating. But for the 3 to 4 weeks that your transplants are growing in the greenhouse or whatever, you can be either growing something else in that bed, or they're not in the bed with weeds growing. You can cultivate your bed, prepare it, and then put 3 to 4 week old plants in your bed that you didn't have to keep cultivated for those weeks that they were in pots. Number 3, use tight plant spacings. The plant leaves should be touching each other when the plant is like 3/4 to full size. That way the leaves from the plants shade out all the weeds that are trying to grow underneath them, and then you have a lot less weed pressure that way. And also, if you cram your plants into a bed as tight as you can get them without being overcrowded, you get more produce per square foot that way. Number 4, use stale seed beds. This is when you prepare your bed 2 or more weeks before you're going to transplant your plants into the bed, and then you water your bed and all the weeds start to grow. Then you cultivate, or you could use a flame weeder. Then you water, and you just try to get as many weeds to grow before you put your transplants in the bed, and then you kill them. So you're killing as many weed seeds before your plants even get to the bed. Number 5, use specialized cultivating tools. Using the proper tool for the job really saves time and is way more efficient. If you have to get down on your hands and knees to pull weeds out, that's just a waste of time. Like I talked about earlier, the collinear hoe and the stirrup hoe are 2 of my favorites. There's also the wire weeder, which is basically this rake with really flimsy wire tines on it, and you can just run that over your plants, and the tines will kind of like go around your plants, but it will just stir up the surface of the soil enough to kind of stir up your weeds, but it won't really harm your plants at all. Then there is the flex tine weeder and the wheel hoe. I'll leave a link in the description to all these tools so you can find them there. Number 6, schedule time for cultivating. For me, on my farm, every Thursday is when I try to cultivate as much as I can. And you just cultivate every Thursday, and that is a huge thing to keeping your weed population down. Number 7, use shallow till or no-till methods. This keeps you from bringing up more weed seeds to the surface. If you just disturb the very surface of the soil just enough that you need, then you're not bringing seeds up from the seed bank that's down 6 inches or whatever underneath your soil. There's methods like using a broad fork that loosens your soil, but it doesn't turn it over, so you're not bringing weed seeds up to the surface. Number 8, use plastic and fabric mulch. What I like to do is try to use landscape fabric on as many crops as I possibly can. Just this year we're using Salanova lettuce, and that way we can use landscape fabric from Farmer's Friend, link in description, and that way we don't even have to cultivate. You just put the landscape fabric down, put your lettuce in, and it's pretty much maintenance free until you need to pull it out and put your next crop in. A general rule of thumb is any crop that's going to be in the ground 60 days or longer should have some sort of landscape fabric around it. Number 9, use organic mulches. This adds a lot of organic matter to your soil while reducing weed pressure. This is good for crops like potatoes or anything with vines like melons. You can't really get in there and cultivate because there's vines everywhere. Potatoes, you don't really want to cultivate those because there's potatoes under the ground. So you just put old hay or grass clippings, something like that. You just put a bunch of that down. It keeps the weeds down, and for melons anyway, it keeps the melons off of the dirt, so you don't have as much of a dirty mess on your melons. For potatoes, it keeps your potatoes from coming to the surface and getting green on them. Those are the crops that I mainly use organic mulches on, but there is a ton of different crops you can use mulches on. Some people put wood chips down their pathways. There's a lot of different options with that. The only downside to that is if it's something that loves heat, like a tomato or peppers or something like that, the organic mulch kind of keeps your soil cooler, which can be a downside for heat-loving crops like that. Number 10, use silage tarps. Silage tarps are probably the most useful thing on this farm, because whenever there's not plants in the ground, you put a silage tarp down. You always want your ground to be covered. You want to keep them down for at least 3 weeks. In the summer when it's really hot, maybe a little less, but in the winter months, it's at least 3 to 4 weeks. You're going to need to keep it down. Silage tarps are really good because you can have all of your leftovers from the harvest on the bed. You water, then you put your silage tarp down, and it just decomposes so fast, as well as it encourages all the earthworms to come up. They eat all of the decaying stuff, they bring it down into the soil, and it just adds a lot of organic matter to the soil. It loosens the soil up, it keeps the soil moist, and it kills your weeds at the same time because they're black on one side, so it gets really warm in the silage tarp even when it's cold out, but as long as the sun's out, it still gets warm under the silage tarp, and so all of your weed seeds start to germinate, but then there's no light and they can't grow, so then they die. So silage tarps are one of the most important tools for keeping your farm weed free. Number 11, flame weeding. Just like I talked about earlier in the stale seed bedding, flame weeding is a good way to quickly kill small weeds in your bed. Farmer's Friend makes a flame weeder. I'll leave a link to that in the description. You just push it over your 30-inch bed. You don't even have to burn the weeds. You basically just heat the weeds up enough so that the cells in the leaves burst, and they look fine, but then you come back a couple hours later and they're all wilted and dying. Another thing you can use a flame weeder for is things like carrots that take a long time to germinate. You plant your carrots in a obviously weed-free bed, but then what some people do is they plant a little bit of radish seeds and like the end of their carrot bed. That way when the radish seeds start to grow, I guess usually the weeds start to grow at the same time. So then they'll run their flame weeder over their carrot bed, and then a couple days later your carrots will come up and they'll come up in a weed-free bed. I've also used the flame weeder for bigger weeds. I've used it for asparagus. Like before the asparagus comes up, you just go over your asparagus patch and burn up the weeds basically. There's a lot of different things you can use a flame weeder for, so that's a really good option for weed control as well. Number 12, clear plastic solarization. This only works if it's really hot outside and sunny, but if you have this one area where it's just kind of weedy, has a lot of weed seeds or whatever, it works really good in the greenhouse. You water the area well, and then instead of putting a silage tarp down, you put clear plastic down. You make sure all of the edges are nice and sealed, and then when it gets hot, it gets really hot inside there, and the weeds start to germinate, and when it gets really hot, everything just dies. The weeds die, the weed seeds die, and basically is like a massive flamethrower that you can cover a big area with. Number 13, never let weeds go to seed. The saying is 1 year seeding is 7 years weeding. So you don't want your yard to go to seed, you don't want any weeds going to seed around where you're growing your produce, because it will take a long time to kill all those seeds. Number 14, use smother crops to outcompete the weeds. There's a couple different ways people do this. One is cover crops. You just put in a cover crop and it outcompetes the weeds. Number 2 is a green manure, which is basically the same as a cover crop. Might plant a little different plants, but then you plant that with the intention of tilling it back into the soil to add organic manure to the soil to feed the soil. You can do this in a lot of different ways. Some people, even in their big field crops, they'll plant a crop of rye in the fall, let it grow up to 3 inches, 3 or 4 inches, let it overwinter, then in the spring it grows to its full height, and then they crimp it and kill it, and it lays down like a mulch, and then you just no-till your corn or whatever into this basically mulched field. Some people even plant like a cover crop underneath their corn or in between on their walkways, or I mean, you can use cover crops for a lot of different situations. Some good crops to grow in the summer are buckwheat, cowpeas, soybeans, and sorghum sudan grass. And some good crops to grow in the winter are wheat, rye, grain, ryegrass, crimson clover, and vetch. And the thicker you seed them, the more successful you will be at keeping weeds from growing. That's it for this video. I hope you were able to learn something. And just remember, a weed-free farm is a much more enjoyable place to be.